Hello everybody, welcome to Tangle 10. So today we're going to add a database to our project. This used to be a big difficult thing to do where you'd have to install it on your local machine. It would have to be the same version as whatever you're deploying to, but now in the age of Docker, this is a lot easier. So the first thing we're going to do is add a Docker Compose file. This is going to be the instructions for setting things up that you're going to run in Docker. So go to your project directory up here and right click and do new file. And then type in docker-compose YML, which is the extension for YAML, which is a way of specifying properties. Every Docker Compose file starts with a line that says services with a colon. And then you have to name your service. So I'm going to call it Postgres. Every service needs an image. Here, I'll just put in Postgres. Next is ports, which you need to put it as a list of port mappings. The way that YAML does ports is by going on the next line and putting a dash here. And I'm going to use port of 6000. And just so you understand how this works, in Docker Compose, this is the external port. That's the port that everything in your machine is using. And then this is the internal port. This is the port that the Postgres instance within Docker is using. So we're mapping this port to this port. I'm not using this port because it's being used by something else. All right, next up is the environment. This is where you can create your environment variables that are used by the software in the container. So I'm going to need Postgres user, not username, and that'll be website, and then Postgres password. I'm putting a plain text password in here because it's throwaway. And then Postgres DB, we'll call the database Tangle. Now you might wonder where it's getting Postgres from. And because this is a Docker Compose file, it is going to look for an image called Postgres within Docker Hub and just magically download it and install it. So let's do that. First, make sure that Docker is running. And then you can see up here the little Docker icon, and it says Docker desktop is running. So I can always close this here, and then this stays up here. Go to my command line and make sure you're in your working directory. So I'm going to type in Tangle, and you can see my Docker Compose file. Compose is a subcommand of Docker. So you type Docker Compose, so Docker space compose, and then it has its own subcommand, which is up, which basically means go use the instructions in Docker Compose file and bring up Docker. And it says database system is ready to accept connections. Now notice that this is going to be just running in the shell, which means I can't do anything. This is not actually doing anything. So another way of doing this, when you run the command, remember I hit up arrow to bring the last command. I'm going to put an ampersand at the end. And what this does is it runs it in the background so that you can continue to use your shell. So the same thing happens. It's starting up, but this time when I click enter, I get the prompt back. To wire this new database up to Spring, we need to go into the application properties. I'm going to change the extension here. I don't want to use the properties file format. I'm going to use YAML instead. So I hit Shift F6 to rename. There are certain keyboard shortcuts that are really worth learning, and this is one. And then I hit refactor, and now it's a YAML file. All Spring properties start with Spring. We want to define a data source. and all data sources need a URL. This is fairly complicated. Just follow the pattern. It's JDBC colon PostgreSQL colon / localhost, and then the port that you were using, which is 6000. We changed it from the default, and then the database name, which is Tangle. Next is the username, which is website. Just to point out, in the Docker Compose file, it's a little confusing. This one says user, and this one says username. And the password, which, yes, I'm going to put it clear text password into this file because it's a throwaway password. And last, we need the driver class name. This is the JDBC driver, which is going to be org Postgres driver. Now you can see here that it doesn't like this because it doesn't see it in the project. To add it, I'm going to copy this and then search for it in Maven Central, which is a repository of lots and lots of Maven artifacts. So simply by typing the word Maven and then putting that in here, the first thing comes up is going to be the component that's in Maven. I'll just pick the top one here. And then down here you can see it gives you a little sample of what you can put in your Maven file. So I'm just going to take this without the comment. This is a comment. And go to my POM file and put it at the bottom. Normally when you're adding something new, it will show this as red because it's not downloaded yet. You click this little button here, the M, and that'll reach out to Maven Central and get the files and then add it to your project. So it's all wired up. Let's go back to application. All right, so you see that this is still not happy. And the reason is that I need to put the QL because that's the actual package name. And now it's happy. So we got things wired up, but now we have to write some code that actually uses the database. Spring makes it very easy. I'm going to create a new class, and I'm going to call it tan entry repo for repository. Now this is going to be an interface. So I'll talk about what the difference between a class and an interface is later. It fills this in, and I need to extend a particular interface within Spring, which is called JPA repository. And then I'm going to put in my Pojo class, which is tan entry. And then I need to put in something else, which is the ID type, which is long. So I know this looks all very complicated, but just follow the example. Spring comes with a lot of stuff built in, but not everything. And as you can see, this JPA repository, it says it cannot resolve it, and it's not suggesting an import. So that means that this is not in the project. So the way to get it in the project, usually I'll just copy and paste this to a Google search. Here, I'll put Maven here too. Actually, I want something called a starter, which is a bigger bundle. And pick the top one and put it in the POM file. As always, hit the M. And now going back to the repo. Now when I hover over this, it suggests the imports, and I do option return, and it imports it up here. Believe it or not, this is all you need to do to wire up a database in Spring. Let's try it out. I'm going to stop Spring by clicking this big stop button up here, and then run it again and see what happens. No errors, so let's see if we can open up the database. So over here you see this database. I'm going to click that, click plus, and then data source, and you can pick Postgres. I'm going to call this Tangle at localhost, and the host is localhost, but we changed the port to 6000, and the user is website, and the password is web8gopher, and the database is Tangle, And then you can see this is pretty much the same URL that we put into the properties file. So it's not finding the driver file that we got before. So let's hit download, and that makes it go away. And let's test the connection. And it succeeded. Click OK. Now you can see this listed here in your databases pane. If I open this up, you'll see that there is a Tangle database. Now there's currently nothing inside it, which is the next thing we have to do. There are a lot of ways of initializing a database. You can have Spring look at your POJOs and create tables automatically, but that has its own problems. You can create DDLs and other things, but they have their own problems. So let's just skip right to the best solution, which is using a tool called Flyway. So I'm going to go here and type Maven Flyway. And it says Flyway Core. I'm going to pick the top one and add it to my POM. Click the M. Flyway needs a little bit of configuration. It has its own configuration file. So I'm going to make a file in my main root and call it Flyway Conf. It's going to use the same properties as your Spring data source. So I'm just going to copy this into Flyway Conf. And then I have to make it work by putting it into traditional property format, which is equals, and put Flyway in front of it. So I'll just copy and paste this to each one of these. And the equal signs. One little complication is that this is user, not username. I know people keep going back and forth between this. And the last thing you need is Flyway schemas. And it's just the database name. All right, so that's your Flyway configuration. Flyway is a database migration tool. You can think of it as kind of a version control for schemas. I'm going to click on my resources directory here and then add a folder, DB, and then a folder under that, migration, and then a folder under that, PostgreSQL, and then create a file within it that has a very specific file name. So it's going to be V001 and then 2 underscores, then all caps, init database, and then SQL. Whenever we change the schema that our app is using, we'll be using like V002 and so forth. So this is a SQL file. And so it's asking, should we change the dialect? And sure. So let's use Postgres dialect. And now we're just going to put in a table definition. Like a lot of things that I'll be doing, you don't have to learn SQL. Just follow patterns. So I'm going to do create table and then give it a name. And I'm going to give it a name that Spring is going to expect. So it's going to be tan underscore entry. And then put a paren with a semicolon at the bottom. And then inside you define your fields. Title, varchar 255, author, varchar 255, body, and this is different, text. So these are limited to 255 variable characters. That's where varchar comes from. And this is a blob of text and doesn't really have a length. So in addition to these three fields, which match the Pojo that we created, we're going to also want to have an ID field. And I'm going to put a key in as well, a string key. So again, you don't have to know what this means. All you need to know is that whenever you make an ID, just use the same format in any of your tables. So this just means that it's a big serial integer. It's not null. It can never be null, and it's used as a primary key. And then for the key field, I'm going to do varchar 36 and make it unique. So this means that this value cannot be duplicated for any of the entries in the table. We need to add these to the Pojo as well. So I'm going to open up entry, and so JPA uses an annotation of ID for unique IDs. You can also put in generated value, so it'll automatically create the ID, and then make it a long, and then string key. I also want to make this a JPA entity, and all you got to do that is put in the word entity here. All right, so this should work. Let's try running it and see if it creates the database. Looking good. Let's go into the database and do a refresh. And we've got two tables, including tan entry. You can see that it's got the 5 columns here, and it's also got a table which is called Flyway schema history, and this keeps track of the changes in the database. So we have a working database. So how do we fill it with data? Well, that'll wait until next episode when I start showing Cucumber. Thanks for listening.